Welcome to the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu. And, today we're going to jump into a fascinating topic, something that you brought to our attention. And I think it's really going to resonate with our listeners, those who are looking to really kind of, grasp knowledge quickly and thoroughly and have those aha moments.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know those moments where you sort of like, you feel like you get it, without being overwhelmed by
We're
information?
not feeling like you're drowning in information.
Precisely, yeah. That's exactly it.
So we're going to be taking a deep dive today into Instinct, the book Instinct, a comprehensive guide to rewiring your brain for success.
Yes, the 1 hour guide.
The 1 Hour Guide by Rebecca Heiss.
Now, Rebecca Heiss, that's right.
And this 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu, it really explores this idea of how our evolutionary instincts can sometimes work against us, especially in these modern contexts of like leadership and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it? These instincts that were so crucial for our survival way back when can now actually be kind of tripping us up in the modern world, the fast-paced business environments that we find ourselves in today.
So in this 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu, Dr. Heiss, she's a biologist and she's also a leadership consultant, and she makes a really compelling case for understanding these, primal urges, these instincts that we have,
These deep-seated urges, yeah.
and then rewiring our brains so that we can actually leverage these instincts to make better decisions, to be more innovative, and to lead more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about recognizing those moments where our sort of ingrained reactions, our instinctive responses might not be serving us as well as they could in today's world.
Right. And so the book really starts off by kind of setting up this paradox, this clash between, these ancient instincts that we have and the demands of the modern world.
It's like this collision, between our ancient wiring and our modern realities.
Exactly. And it highlights, several key instincts, things like the survival instinct, the need to belong, self-deception, the craving for variety,
That constant search for something new, something better.
a fear of the other, those who are different from us,
That sense of distrust or suspicion, right?
the urge to gather every bit of information we can, and even those, reproductive instincts that are kind of tied to status and power.
Yeah, those primal drives that are still so deeply rooted within us.
And it makes this point that all of these instincts served a very important evolutionary purpose. They helped us to survive, to
To
reproduce.
thrive in a completely different environment, right?
Exactly. But in today's fast-paced business world, these same instincts can sometimes lead to, some real challenges.
It's like they can hold us back, reaching our full potential.
So, I mean, a really great example of this, that the book gives is the fight or flight response.
Oh yeah, that classic physiological reaction.
Yeah, so you can imagine, back in the day, if you were suddenly confronted by, a dangerous predator,
Like a saber-toothed tiger.
right, you need to react instantly.
You need that surge of adrenaline to either fight or flee.
Exactly. And that was essential for survival. But now put yourself in a high-pressure business situation, maybe a difficult negotiation, or you're facing a really tight project deadline.
The pressure's on, right?
The pressure's on, and you have that same fight or flight response kicking in, and suddenly it's not so helpful.
It's like your body's reacting as if you're facing a physical threat, but the situation is completely different.
Yeah, and that surge of stress hormones, the adrenaline, the cortisol, it can actually impair your thinking.
It can cloud your judgment, make it harder to make rational decisions.
Exactly. So the book then really digs into, how we can actually master these survival instincts.
And when we sort of tame them,
Right.
so to speak.
Right. And it explains how, in the modern world, that constant activation of the survival instinct can actually lead to chronic stress, even when there's no immediate threat to our physical safety.
It's like our bodies and minds are constantly on high alerts.
Yeah, and it talks about the role of cortisol, the stress hormone that gets released, and how chronic exposure to cortisol can have all sorts of negative effects on our health and well-being.
Yeah, it can impact our sleep, our immune system, even our cognitive function.
Right, and it can really affect our ability to think strategically, to be creative, to problem solve effectively.
It's like it puts us in a constant state of reactivity rather than allowing us to be more proactive and thoughtful.
And so the book emphasizes that the goal isn't necessarily to eliminate these instincts altogether.
I mean, that's probably not even possible.
Yeah, and in some situations, they can still be very helpful, but it's about recognizing when these instincts are being triggered in a way that's not actually serving us in the modern context.
It's about becoming aware of those moments when our instincts are taking over and we're reacting rather than responding thoughtfully.
And then learning how to consciously manage those responses.
learning how to choose a different path, a more effective path.
Right. So the book offers some really practical strategies. One of the first things it talks about is simply becoming more aware, learning to recognize and label those instinctive reactions as they happen.
It's like shining a light on those automatic responses.
Yeah. So, for example, imagine you're a tech company and you're about to launch a major new product, and suddenly there's a critical technology failure.
Oh, that's a nightmare scenario.
It is. And your immediate reaction might be this wave of panic.
The sky is falling, right?
Exactly. But the first step, according to the book, is to actually just pause for a moment and say to yourself, okay, this is my survival instinct kicking in.
Just label it, acknowledge it.
Exactly. And that simple act of labeling can actually be incredibly powerful.
It helps to engage the more rational parts of your brain, to step back from that immediate emotional reaction,
Right. And it gives you that little bit of space to choose a more thoughtful response.
to move from reacting to responding.
Then the book talks about this concept of slow down to speed up, or festina lente.
It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it's really about taking that pause, that moment to assess the situation before rushing into action.
Right. And it gives this great example of a tech company that was facing a major crisis. And their initial instinct was to, just scramble to find a fix, to assign blame, to make changes really quickly.
To try to put out the fire as fast as possible.
Yeah, but instead, they consciously decided to step back to analyze the situation calmly.
To really get to the root of the problem.
Exactly. And they ended up resolving the issue much more effectively, and they actually strengthened their credibility in the long run.
So it's really a reminder that sometimes the most efficient path isn't the one that feels the fastest in the moment.
Another key lesson is about how we frame stress, instead of seeing it as something purely negative and threatening.
It's something to be avoided at all costs.
The book suggests trying to view stress as a positive challenge, an opportunity for growth and development.
It's like reframing it as a source of energy, a motivator.
Exactly. And it emphasizes that our perception of stress actually plays a huge role in our physiological response to it.
So if you believe you have the resources to handle a challenge, that stress can actually enhance your focus and performance
It can help you to rise to the occasion.
instead of feeling overwhelmed and defeated.
The book also talks about the importance of limiting cognitive overload, recognizing that our brains can only process so much information at once.
We have limited bandwidth, right?
Exactly. So it suggests being very deliberate about prioritizing deep work, minimizing distractions, and focusing on one thing at a time.
It's about being more intentional with our attention and energy.
Right. And avoiding that feeling of being constantly overwhelmed, which can often trigger those, less helpful survival instincts and can lead to poor decision making.
It's about creating space for clarity and focus.
And then there's this really interesting point about actively seeking out novelty to actually rewire our brains.
It's like giving our brains a workout.
Yeah, so exposing ourselves to new experiences, learning new skills, these things can actually help to increase our cognitive flexibility.
To make our brains more adaptable and resilient.
Exactly. And it can help to kind of override some of those more rigid, outdated, instinctive responses.
It's like we're creating new neural pathways.
And another really important point is about fostering psychological safety within teams and organizations.
Yeah, creating an environment where people feel safe to take risks, to speak up, to share their ideas without fear of judgment or punishment.
Because when people feel like failure is not an option,
When they're afraid to make a mistake.
that survival instinct kicks in and
Yeah.
they become much less likely, to be creative, to innovate, to really contribute their full potential.
It's like they're shutting down. They're going into self-preservation mode.
Right. So creating that sense of safety where people feel comfortable experimenting and learning from their mistakes is absolutely essential for, long-term growth and innovation.
It's about fostering a culture of trust and openness.
And finally, the book emphasizes the importance of training our brains through practices like mindfulness and self-reflection.
Taking the time to observe our own thoughts and feelings, our patterns of behavior,
And to consciously choose more effective responses.
to become more intentional in our actions.
Right. And the book actually uses Apple's approach to innovation under Steve Jobs as an example of how a leader can resist those impulsive short-term reactions.
Those knee-jerk reactions that are often driven by that survival instinct.
And instead, really cultivate a mindset that's focused on the long-term vision.
It's about having the discipline to stay true to your core values and goals, even when you're under pressure.
Exactly. So the book also delves into how these really deep-seated instincts manifest in areas like gender, power, and leadership.
It explores how our biological instincts can actually influence the dynamics of the workplace and even shape our unconscious expectations of different genders and leadership roles.
Right. And so it specifically talks about reproductive instincts and how they can contribute to these historical differences in gender roles and
Just like
behaviors.
those primal drives are still playing out in these subtle ways.
And while these differences may have had some evolutionary advantages in the past, they can now actually be a significant source of unconscious bias in the workplace.
Leading to things like, subtle discrimination against women in leadership positions, for example.
Right, and the book offers some really, I think, important practical steps for addressing this, and it starts with simply acknowledging that these biological instincts do influence our perceptions and behaviors, often without us even realizing it.
It's about bringing those unconscious biases to light, making them conscious.
And then it talks about the importance of redefining what we consider to be effective leadership qualities, moving beyond those traditionally masculine norms.
So not just focusing on assertiveness or dominance, but recognizing the value of collaboration, empathy, emotional intelligence.
Exactly, because these are all qualities that are essential for effective leadership in today's complex and interconnected world.
And they're often qualities that are associated with, more feminine leadership styles.
And the book also emphasizes the importance of creating environments that actively reduce bias and stereotyping.
So things like implementing blind evaluations in the hiring process, promoting open discussions about workplace dynamics.
And addressing the impact of power dynamics on things like sexual harassment.
It's about creating a culture of respect and equity.
And then it talks about really challenging this idea of status as the primary driver of decision making, advocating for a focus on competence and expertise instead.
It's about valuing substance over style.
Exactly. And it highlights Salesforce's commitment to addressing gender pay gaps as a real-world example of a company that's actively working to counteract these instinctual biases.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Absolutely. Another really fascinating area the book explores is the paradox of choice.
Ah, yes, the tyranny of too many options.
And it explains how our instinct for variety, which was once so beneficial, it helped us to find food, to avoid danger.
To explore new possibilities.
Now it can actually lead to a lot of indecision and even dissatisfaction in a world where we're bombarded with so many choices.
It's like we're drowning in options.
Exactly. And the book talks about decision fatigue, that feeling of being overwhelmed by too many choices.
And that constant fear of missing out, that FOMO.
That feeling that there's always something better out there.
Which can make it really hard to commit to anything.
And so the book offers some really practical tips for managing this paradox of choice. And the first is simply recognizing that having more choices doesn't necessarily lead to better decisions or greater happiness.
It's about acknowledging the downside of too much choice.
Right. Then it talks about the importance of prioritizing and eliminating distractions, really focusing on what's truly important.
Simplifying, streamlining.
Exactly. And it recommends using decision-making frameworks to help us stay objective and avoid getting overwhelmed by the sheer number of possibilities.
Having a system in place can make it easier to navigate those complex choices.
And it talks about adopting a less is more mindset.
Focusing on what we already have. Refining and optimizing, instead of constantly chasing the next new thing.
And committing to a strategy and giving it time to work, instead of constantly jumping ship.
Having that patience and persistence.
The book also suggests reframing constraints as opportunities for creativity and innovation.
It's like turning limitations into advantages.
And cultivating a sense of contentment with the decisions we make.
Learning to appreciate what we have.
And it gives some great examples of companies and individuals that have managed this paradox of choice really effectively. Companies like Spotify with its focus on music streaming, and investors like Warren Buffett with his very disciplined investment strategy.
It's about choosing your lane and sticking to it.
Now, let's move on to something that I think we all struggle with to some extent, and that's the lies we tell ourselves, or self-deception.
Oh, yeah. We all have our blind spots.
And the book explains how this is actually a natural protective mechanism.
It's a way to protect our egos, to maintain a sense of self-worth.
But it can also be a major obstacle to our growth and progress, especially in leadership roles.
It can prevent us from seeing our own weaknesses, from acknowledging when we need to make changes.
And it can lead us to ignore important feedback, to resist necessary adaptations, and to generally overestimate our own
It's
capabilities.
like we're living in a self-created bubble of illusion.
And the book gives this really stark example of Kodak's failure to adapt to the rise of digital photography.
A classic case of a company clinging to its past success.
Even though they had a hand in developing the technology that ultimately disrupted their entire business.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of clinging to outdated beliefs and resisting change.
And so the book offers some really valuable lessons for overcoming self-deception, and the first is simply acknowledging that we all do it. It's a part of being human.
It's about taking ownership of our own biases.
Right. Then it talks about the importance of seeking out objective data to challenge our assumptions.
Looking at the evidence rather than just relying on our gut feelings or our own perceptions.
And surrounding ourselves with people who will give us honest feedback, even when it's difficult to hear.
People who are willing to call us out on our BS.
It also talks about reframing mistakes as learning opportunities.
Seeing failures as stepping stones to success.
And developing a habit of regular self-reflection to identify our own patterns of bias.
Taking the time to really examine our own thoughts and behaviors.
And fostering a culture of constructive conflict within organizations where people feel comfortable challenging each other's ideas.
It's about creating a space where healthy debate and dissent are encouraged.
And finally, being willing to pivot when necessary, even when it means admitting that a previous strategy wasn't working.
It's about having the courage to change course when the evidence suggests it's necessary.
The book points to the turnaround at Microsoft under Satya Nadella and Tesla's approach to continuous improvement as examples of organizations that have successfully navigated the potential pitfalls of self-deception.
It's about embracing feedback, learning from mistakes, and constantly evolving.
Another incredibly fundamental human need that the book explores is the power of belonging.
That deep-seated desire to be part of a group, to feel connected to something larger than ourselves.
And it talks about how this need can foster, really strong team cohesion and a sense of engagement.
It's about creating a sense of shared purpose and identity.
But it can also lead to conformity and the exclusion of those who are perceived as being different.
It's that in-group versus out-group dynamic.
Right, and so the book offers some guidance for managing this instinct for belonging in a way that's healthy and productive.
It's about harnessing the power of belonging without falling into the traps of groupthink or exclusion.
So it starts with recognizing how powerful this need for belonging can be and how it can influence our decision-making, sometimes in ways that we don't even realize.
It's about understanding how our desire to fit in can sometimes override our better judgment.
It talks about the importance of encouraging diverse perspectives within teams.
Making sure that everyone feels valued and heard, regardless of their background or beliefs.
And building psychological safety so that people feel comfortable voicing dissenting opinions.
It's about creating a space where people feel safe to be themselves and to share their ideas without fear of reprisal.
And then actively combating exclusion and bias.
Challenging those ingrained preferences for the in-group.
Encouraging healthy conflict and debate.
Recognizing that disagreement can actually lead to better outcomes.
And aligning company values with the individual identities of employees.
Creating a sense of shared purpose and meaning.
And finally, recognizing and celebrating the unique contributions of individuals.
Making people feel appreciated and valued for who they are.
The book mentions Google and Patagonia as examples of companies that have cultivated really strong cultures belonging.
Companies where people feel deeply connected to the mission and to each other.
Now let's talk about a potentially uncomfortable but really important instinct, and that's the fear of the other.
That deep-seated suspicion of those who are different from us.
And the book explains that this instinct has its roots in our evolutionary past. When encountering unknown groups could be dangerous.
It was a survival mechanism, a way to protect ourselves from potential threats.
But in today's world, this instinct manifests as unconscious bias and prejudice.
It can lead to discrimination, exclusion, and conflict.
And it can really limit innovation and collaboration.
Because we're missing out on the unique perspectives and ideas of those who are different from us.
So the book offers some strategies for overcoming this fear of the other, and it starts with recognizing that bias is a natural human instinct. It's not necessarily a sign of being a bad person.
It's about understanding that we all have biases, even if we don't want to admit it.
And then actively seeking out different perspectives. Intentionally engaging with people who are different from us in terms of their backgrounds, their beliefs, their experiences.
Expanding our horizons, stepping outside our comfort zones.
And fostering psychological safety within teams so that diverse voices feel comfortable speaking up.
creating a space where everyone feels valued and respected,
And challenging our default assumptions when we're making decisions.
questioning our own biases, looking for alternative perspectives.
Redefining leadership and success to be more inclusive of diversity.
Broadening our definitions of what it means to be successful.
And even seeking out situations that might feel a little uncomfortable or uncertain.
Embracing the unknown, challenging our own fears.
And finally, measuring and tracking our progress on diversity and inclusion efforts.
Holding ourselves accountable for creating real change.
The book highlights Airbnb's efforts to combat discrimination on its platform and Starbucks' implementation of racial bias training as examples of organizations that are actively trying to address this issue.
It's about taking concrete steps to create a more equitable and just world.
Now, finally, let's talk about information overload, something that I think we can all relate to in this digital age.
Oh, absolutely. We're constantly bombarded with information from all directions.
And the book talks about this paradox of having access to more information than ever before, but still struggling to make good decisions.
It's like we're drowning in data but starving for wisdom.
Exactly. And it talks about analysis paralysis, the difficulty of filtering valuable insights from all the noise.
That feeling of being overwhelmed and indecisive.
So the book offers some key lessons for managing information overload, and it starts with recognizing that more information doesn't necessarily equal better decisions.
Sometimes less is more.
And prioritizing the right information, not just the most information.
Being selective, focusing on what's truly relevant.
Limiting the number of sources that we consume information from.
Choosing quality over quantity.
And training our brains to think critically about the information we do consume, evaluating its reliability and relevance.
Becoming more discerning consumers of information.
Embracing decisiveness, even in the face of some uncertainty.
Making a choice and moving forward.
And using mental models and frameworks to streamline our decision-making processes.
Having a system in place can make it easier to navigate complex situations.
And finally, fostering a culture of action over perfection.
It's about getting things done, not getting bogged down in endless analysis.
The book points back to examples like Apple's focus on simplicity and Warren Buffett's disciplined approach to investment information as models for effectively managing this challenge of information overload.
It's about having a clear vision, a strong set of principles, and the discipline to stick to them.
So as we've explored in this deep dive into instinct, a comprehensive guide to rewiring your brain for success 1-hour guide, which is of course brought to you by the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu. Understanding and managing our primal instincts is absolutely crucial for achieving greater effectiveness in today's complex world.
It's about becoming more conscious of our own deeply ingrained tendencies and making more deliberate choices about how we respond to the challenges and opportunities that we face.
And that really aligns with the core mission of the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu, which is to provide you with concise, actionable, and valuable knowledge.
So as we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with a question. Which of these instincts that we've discussed today might be exerting the strongest influence in your own life or work?
And as a final thought, consider one specific area where you suspect an instinctive reaction might be hindering your progress or effectiveness, and think about how you could apply some of the lessons from this deep dive to approach that situation differently.
It's about taking that awareness and turning it into action.
Thank you for joining us today, and for a more in-depth exploration of these concepts and many other valuable business insights, be sure to check out the full book, Instinct, a comprehensive guide to rewiring your brain for success 1-hour guide, available on the 1-hour guide website. This has been the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu.
Thanks for listening.